September 20th, 1944, noon. Major Charles Carpenter circled his tiny L-4 Grasshopper observation plane over fog-shrouded French farmland near Arracourt, waiting for visibility to improve enough to spot German positions. The fog had been thick all morning, preventing him from seeing the ground, forcing him to circle uselessly while somewhere below American troops were pinned down by German armor they couldn't see and couldn't fight. Carpenter was frustrated. He had been frustrated since arriving in France earlier that year, frustrated by the limitations of his role as an artillery spotter, frustrated by the fact that his job was to locate enemy tanks and call in artillery strikes rather than attacking them directly, frustrated by the reality that he flew an unarmed observation plane that could do nothing but watch while men died on the ground beneath him. But today was different. Today his L-4 wasn't unarmed anymore. Mounted on the wing struts beneath his fabric and wood aircraft were 6 M1 Bazookas, wired electronically to switches in his cockpit, loaded with armor-piercing rockets capable of penetrating 3 inches of steel. He had named his plane Rosie the Rocketer after the cultural icon representing women working in American factories, and he had spent weeks preparing it for this moment, this chance to do more than observe, this opportunity to actually kill the tanks that were killing American soldiers. When the fog finally lifted just past noon, Carpenter spotted a company of German Panther tanks and armored cars advancing toward American positions. He pushed the stick forward and dove. Charles Carpenter was born August 29, 1912, in rural Illinois, in a farming community near Milan where families grew corn and raised livestock and struggled to make ends meet even in good years. His childhood was shaped by the grinding economic realities of agricultural life in the Midwest, where success depended on weather and crop prices and factors completely beyond anyone's control, where families worked themselves exhausted and still barely survived, where the Depression hit like a hammer, destroying what little financial security people had managed to build. The Carpenter family farm was lost during the Depression, joining thousands of other farms foreclosed by banks unable to extend credit in a collapsing economy, forcing the family to start over in Reynolds, a small town near Edgington, Illinois, where Charles grew up understanding that life could take everything from you, regardless of how hard you worked or how much you deserved better. He was a good student, smart enough to recognize that education offered a path out of agricultural poverty, disciplined enough to earn scholarships that made that path accessible despite his family's financial limitations. He attended Roosevelt Military Academy in Aledo, Illinois on scholarship, getting the kind of structured education that working-class families couldn't normally afford, learning not just academic subjects but military discipline and leadership principles that would shape his approach to life and eventually to combat. From Roosevelt, he went to Center College in Danville, Kentucky, again on scholarship, continuing his education while understanding that every opportunity he received was one his family couldn't have provided without the generosity of institutions that recognize potential regardless of economic circumstances. After completing his education, Carpenter became a history teacher, returning to Illinois to teach at Urbana High School, where he introduced students to the patterns and lessons of previous wars, explaining how battles were won and lost, how strategic decisions affected outcomes, how individual actions could change the course of events. He was good at it, patient and knowledgeable, the kind of teacher students remembered years later for making history come alive rather than presenting it as a series of dates and names to memorize. His was a quiet life, ordinary and respectable, teaching Monday through Friday, grading papers in the evenings, discussing lesson plans with colleagues, living the kind of stable middle-class existence that his parents' generation had worked so hard to achieve. There was nothing in that life that suggested he would become one of the most feared pilots in the European theater, nothing that indicated he possessed the kind of aggressive courage that would earn him multiple combat decorations and the respect of soldiers on both sides of the war. When America entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, Carpenter was approaching 30 years old enough that he could have avoided military service without shame, established enough in his career that leaving would mean real sacrifice, settled enough that the disruption of war service would be genuinely difficult. He enlisted anyway. In 1942, he joined the U.S. Army and applied for flight training, wanting to contribute to the war effort in a way that matched his capabilities, understanding that pilots were desperately needed, but that not everyone had the aptitude or the discipline to fly. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant and sent to training, where he learned to fly observation and liaison aircraft, the small, slow planes that operated at low altitude, providing reconnaissance and artillery spotting for ground forces. It wasn't glamorous work. Fighter pilots got the glory and the headlines. Bomber pilots flew the big missions that destroyed German industry and infrastructure. But observation pilots like Carpenter did the grinding daily work of locating enemy positions so artillery could destroy them, coordinating between ground and air units, providing the reconnaissance that made combined arms operations possible. In 1944, Carpenter arrived in France as part of the massive build-up following the D-Day invasion, assigned to the 4th Armored Division of General George Patton's Third Army, one of the most aggressive and successful American formations in the European theater. Patton believed in speed and violence, in pushing forward relentlessly rather than consolidating gains, in attacking the enemy before they could organize effective defenses. His philosophy permeated every unit in Third Army, including the observation pilots who scouted ahead of advancing tank columns, spotting German positions, and directing artillery fire. Carpenter was assigned an L-4 Grasshopper bearing USAAF serial number 43-324426, a military version of the Piper J-3 Cub civilian aircraft that had been in production since 1938. The L-4 was essentially a powered glider, a simple fabric-covered aircraft with a single engine producing barely enough horsepower to lift the plane and its pilot into the air, designed for low-speed, low-altitude flight rather than combat operations. The specifications told the whole story. Empty weight, 640 pounds, maximum takeoff weight, 100 pounds, maximum speed, 92 miles per hour, service ceiling, 12,000 feet. It was tiny, slow, fragile, completely unarmed, and absolutely unsuited for combat in any conventional sense. But it was perfect for reconnaissance work, able to loiter for hours at low altitude observing enemy movements, quiet enough to approach positions without being heard, maneuverable enough to evade anti-aircraft fire through evasive flying rather than speed or armor. Carpenter flew reconnaissance missions day after day, circling over French countryside, spotting German tanks and artillery positions, radioing coordinates to American artillery units, watching the shells land and adjusting fire until German positions were destroyed. It was important work, necessary work, work that directly contributed to American advances and German casualties. But it wasn't enough for Carpenter. He wanted to do more than observe. He wanted to attack. The frustration built gradually over weeks and months of flying reconnaissance missions, while German tanks killed American soldiers who were advancing too slowly because they didn't have adequate information about enemy positions, who were ambushed by German armor they didn't know was there, who died because the observation planes above them could only watch and report rather than intervene directly. Carpenter heard stories about other L-4 pilots who had begun mounting weapons on their aircraft, improvising armament that turned observation planes into light attack aircraft capable of limited offensive action. The idea took hold in his mind and wouldn't let go. If other pilots could arm their L-birds, why couldn't he? If observation planes could carry weapons, why was he flying an unarmed aircraft when American troops needed every possible advantage against German armor? Working with an ordnance technician and a crew chief from his unit, Carpenter designed a system for mounting M1A1 bazookas on the wing struts of his L-4. The bazooka was a shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon that fired a rocket-propelled grenade capable of penetrating approximately 3 inches of armor plating, enough to destroy or disable German tanks if the rockets hit vulnerable areas like the thin top armor rather than the heavily armored front or sides. The mounting system had to be secure enough to handle the stress of flight and the recoil of firing, but light enough that it wouldn't exceed the L-4's very limited cargo capacity. Carpenter's aircraft, with a 150-pound pilot and no radio aboard, had approximately 232 pounds of available weight capacity for cargo or passengers, which meant the bazookas and their mounting hardware had to stay well under that limit while still providing useful firepower. The initial installation involved 2 bazookas, one mounted on each wing strut, wired electronically to switches in the cockpit that allowed Carpenter to fire them individually or simultaneously. Each bazooka could fire a single rocket, then needed to be reloaded. which meant Carpenter would have to return to base after expending his ammunition, but 2 rockets were better than none. 2 shots at German armor were better than circling helplessly overhead while tanks killed Americans. The modification was completed and Carpenter test-fired the system, discovering that the rockets worked perfectly, that the mounting system held firm during firing, that he could aim and fire while flying the aircraft without destabilizing or losing control. He named his modified L-4 Rosie the Rocketer in honor of Rosie the Riveter, painting nose art on the fuselage celebrating the improvised weapon system he had created. His first combat mission with armed L-4 came soon after the modification was complete. Carpenter took off looking for German vehicles, spotted a German armored car, dove at it, fired a rocket, and watched the armored car explode in flames. It worked. The bazooka system actually worked. He had just destroyed an enemy vehicle using a weapon system that wasn't supposed to exist, mounted on an aircraft that wasn't designed for combat. The possibilities were intoxicating. If he could destroy an armored car, why not a tank? If 2 bazookas worked, why not more? Carpenter returned to his ordnance technician and requested additional weapons. They added 4 more bazookas, bringing the total to 6, 3 mounted on each wing strut, all wired to cockpit switches. The increased weight pushed his L-4 closer to its cargo capacity limit, but not beyond it, and the additional firepower multiplied his offensive capabilities. He also managed to acquire some M9 bazookas, an improved version that could fire M6A3 high-explosive anti-tank rounds specifically designed to penetrate heavy armor, giving him the ability to attack German tanks rather than just light vehicles. The tactical problem was how to employ the bazookas effectively against German armor. Tanks were heavily armored on their fronts and sides where designers expected them to face enemy fire. But the top armor was much thinner because tank designers didn't expect attacks from above. Aircraft attacking tanks needed to hit them from overhead where the armor was weakest, which meant Carpenter had to attack in a shallow dive, approaching from altitude and descending toward his target until he was close enough to aim accurately. Then firing his bazookas and pulling up sharply to avoid ground fire. The shallow dive brought him into range of German machine guns and rifles, exposing him to concentrated small arms fire during the critical seconds when he was lining up his shot and firing his rockets. Every attack was a calculated gamble. Could he destroy the tank before German fire destroyed him? Carpenter's philosophy was straightforward and aggressive. His idea of fighting a war, as he later told reporters, was to attack, and then attack again. He believed the war should be prosecuted 60 minutes an hour and 24 hours a day. That hesitation and caution gave the enemy opportunities they would exploit. That the only way to win was to maintain constant pressure regardless of risk or cost. This wasn't recklessness. This was calculated aggression based on understanding that in war, the side that dictates tempo and maintains initiative usually wins. That defensive thinking leads to defensive outcomes. That attacking forces the enemy to react rather than implementing their own plans. Patton's Third Army valued that mindset, creating an organizational culture that rewarded initiative and punished timidity, and Carpenter thrived in that environment. September 20th, 1944 was the day Carpenter became a legend. The Battle of Arracourt near Nancy, France was underway, a German counteroffensive launched by the 5th Panzer Army attempting to halt American advances and recapture territory lost in previous weeks. German armored forces attacked suddenly, pinning down American support units and threatening to overrun 4th Armored Division headquarters components. The attack came during heavy morning fog that prevented American artillery spotters from seeing German positions, leaving American forces blind and vulnerable while German tanks advanced through obscured terrain that hid them until they were practically on top of American defensive positions. Carpenter took off into the fog despite not being able to see the ground, determined to locate the German attack even though visibility was nearly zero, willing to take the risk of flying blind rather than allowing American troops to be overrun while he sat safely on the ground. He circled for hours waiting for the fog to lift, maintaining altitude while listening to radio reports about the German attack, knowing that American soldiers were fighting and dying below him while he flew uselessly overhead, unable to help. Around noon, the fog finally began dissipating, revealing the ground in patches, giving him brief glimpses of the battlefield. He spotted a company of German Panther tanks and armored cars advancing in formation toward American positions, immediately recognizing that these were the forces that had American units pinned down. Carpenter didn't call in artillery. He didn't radio for support. He pushed his stick forward and dove directly at the German armor. The Germans saw him coming, but didn't take it seriously at first. Observation planes were harmless, unarmed scouts that posed no threat beyond calling artillery strikes, and opening fire on them revealed German positions to American artillery without accomplishing anything useful. The calculus had always favored ignoring L-4s, letting them circle overhead while German forces stayed hidden. Then Carpenter opened fire with his bazookas, and that calculus changed permanently. Rockets streaked from beneath his wings, striking the top armor of Panther tanks, penetrating the thin plating, detonating inside the fighting compartments, killing crews and destroying ammunition. Tanks exploded, armored cars erupted in flames. The remaining Panthers scattered and retreated, their formation broken by the impossible spectacle of an observation plane functioning as an attack aircraft. Carpenter had expended all 6 rockets in a single pass, emptying his weapons in seconds of sustained fire that destroyed or disabled multiple German vehicles, but left him defenseless if he remained over the battlefield. He flew back to base immediately, landed, and shouted at his ground crew to reload the bazookas as fast as possible, that he needed to get back to the battle, that German armor was still attacking, and American troops needed air support. The ordnance team worked frantically reloading the bazooka tubes, while Carpenter stayed in the cockpit, keeping the engine running, ready to take off the moment weapons were loaded. Within minutes, he was airborne again, returning to the battle, attacking the German formation again, firing all 6 rockets again, destroying more vehicles. He flew 3 combat sorties that afternoon, returning to base to reload between each sortie, firing a total of 16 bazooka rockets at the advancing German armor in a continuing series of attacks that broke the German offensive and forced their armor to retreat. Official reports credited Rosie the Rocketer with immobilizing 2 Panther tanks and several armored cars while killing or wounding a dozen or more German soldiers, saving a trapped 4th Armored Division Waterpoint crew who had witnessed Carpenter's attacks and understood they would have been overrun and killed if the German armor hadn't been forced to retreat. Carpenter's attacks that day were instrumental in stopping the German counteroffensive at Arracourt, demonstrating that aggressive offensive action by a single determined pilot in an improvised attack aircraft could achieve strategic results out of all proportion to the resources employed. The Battle of Arracourt made Carpenter famous. Press coverage by Stars and Stripes newspaper brought his story to American troops throughout the European theater, and soon other publications picked it up. Associated Press wire services distributed the story nationally. Popular Science magazine wrote about the technical aspects of mounting bazookas on a Piper Cub. Liberty magazine celebrated him as an example of American ingenuity and courage. The New York Sun gave him front-page treatment as a hometown hero. Soldiers who had never met Carpenter knew about Bazooka Charlie and Rosie the Rocketer, knew about the crazy major who attacked German tanks in an observation plane armed with improvised weapons, knew about his aggressive 3-sortie mission at Arracourt. The Germans knew about him too. They started calling him the Mad Major, recognizing that anyone who would attack Panther tanks in a fabric-covered Piper Cub was either insane or possessed of superhuman courage, possibly both. German forces began shooting at every L-4 they saw, abandoning their previous policy of ignoring observation aircraft in favor of destroying anything that might be armed with bazookas. Carpenter noticed the change immediately. In an interview with a Stars and Stripes correspondent, he explained, "Word must be getting around among those krauts to watch out for Cubs with bazookas on them. Every time I show up now, they shoot with everything they have. They never used to bother Cubs. Bazookas must be bothering them a bit." The understatement was characteristic of Carpenter's personality, downplaying the danger while acknowledging that his tactics were having their intended effect. German troops now fired at him with machine guns, rifles, pistols, anything that could shoot at an aircraft, filling the air around Rosie the Rocketer with bullets every time he appeared over enemy positions. Despite flying dozens of combat missions directly into German fire, Carpenter was never wounded. His aircraft took damage, including at least one bullet hole through a wing, and an incident where he hit a church steeple with one wheel during a low-altitude attack. But he never sustained injury from enemy action, earning him yet another nickname, the Lucky Major. His survival wasn't entirely luck, though it certainly played a role. He was an extremely skilled pilot who understood how to use his aircraft's maneuverability to evade ground fire, diving and pulling up in unpredictable patterns that made accurate shooting difficult, never staying in one position long enough for German gunners to track him effectively. He also attacked decisively and quickly, spending as little time as possible in the kill zone where ground fire was most concentrated, firing his bazookas and immediately pulling out, rather than lingering to assess damage. One of Carpenter's most remarkable exploits occurred after he destroyed a German armored column with his bazookas and decided to land near the battlefield to inspect the wreckage. This was extraordinarily dangerous, landing in contested territory where German forces might still be present, but Carpenter wanted to see the results of his attack up close. While examining the destroyed vehicles, he encountered 6 German soldiers who had survived the attack. Instead of calling for support or retreating to his aircraft, Carpenter picked up a discarded rifle lying on the ground and captured all 6 Germans single-handedly, marching them back to his plane and flying them to American lines as prisoners. The action demonstrated both his courage and his quick thinking, recognizing an opportunity to capture enemy soldiers and acting on it immediately despite being alone and far from support. Another notable mission came when Carpenter spotted American infantry pinned down by German armor and unable to advance. He attacked the German positions with all 6 bazookas, expended his ammunition, flew back to base and rearmed, then returned to the battlefield for a second sortie. After expending his ammunition again, he returned to base once more, rearmed again, and flew a third sortie into the same battle. 3 separate combat missions supporting the same ground engagement, each one requiring him to fly into concentrated enemy fire, each one exposing him to the risk of being shot down, each one demonstrating his absolute commitment to providing whatever support American ground forces needed, regardless of personal danger. By the end of that engagement, he had destroyed 2 German tanks and broken up the enemy attack, allowing the American infantry to advance. Official records credit Carpenter with destroying 6 German tanks, including 2 legendary Tiger tanks, the heavily armored German tanks that were nearly invulnerable to most Allied anti-tank weapons, but could be destroyed by bazooka rockets if hit from above, where their armor was thinnest. The official count of 6 tanks made Carpenter a tank ace, one of very few pilots who achieved that distinction, and certainly the only one who did it flying a Piper Cub. However, unofficial estimates and eyewitness accounts suggest his actual total was much higher, possibly as many as 14 tanks destroyed, plus numerous armored cars and other vehicles. The discrepancy between official and unofficial counts was common in World War II, reflecting the difficulty of confirming kills in the chaos of combat, the bureaucratic requirements for documentation that couldn't always be met in field conditions, and the tendency of official records to be conservative in granting credit unless evidence was unambiguous. Regardless of whether his total was 6 or 14 or some number in between, Carpenter's achievement was extraordinary by any measure. He had taken an unarmed observation aircraft and converted it into a tank destroyer, personally destroying more enemy armor than many tank crews managed to destroy during entire combat tours. Accomplishing this while flying one of the most vulnerable aircraft in the American arsenal directly into enemy fire repeatedly over months of combat operations. He did this not because he was ordered to, not because arming L-4s with bazookas was official doctrine or part of his assigned mission, but because he recognized a capability gap and filled it through initiative and improvisation, because he refused to accept the limitations of his assigned role when those limitations meant American soldiers were dying unnecessarily. Carpenter's aggressive combat flying earned him multiple decorations recognizing his valor and effectiveness. He received the Silver Star, America's 3rd highest military decoration for valor in combat, awarded for gallantry in action against an enemy. He received the Bronze Star with oak leaf cluster, indicating he was awarded the Bronze Star twice for heroic or meritorious service in ground combat. He received the Air Medal with oak leaf cluster, similarly indicating multiple awards for meritorious achievement during aerial operations. These decorations represented formal military recognition of what everyone who served with Carpenter already knew. He was one of the most effective and courageous pilots in Third Army, a tank ace who had achieved the seemingly impossible by destroying heavily armored German vehicles using a tiny observation plane armed with improvised weapons. The end of the war in Europe in May 1945 brought relief and celebration, but also uncertainty about what came next for veterans like Carpenter, who had spent years focused entirely on combat operations and now had to figure out how to return to civilian life. For Carpenter, the transition was complicated by a medical crisis that overshadowed everything else. Shortly after the war ended, he became seriously ill and was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease, a cancer of the lymphatic system that in 1945 had very poor survival rates. Doctors gave him 2 years to live, a death sentence that seemed even more cruel because he had survived years of combat, flying directly into enemy fire without being wounded, only to be killed by disease in peacetime. Carpenter received an honorable discharge from the U.S. Army in 1946 and returned to Illinois, uncertain how much time he had left, but determined to spend it doing something meaningful. He returned to his job teaching history at Urbana High School, walking back into the same classroom where he had taught before the war, resuming the quiet, ordinary life of a small-town teacher as if the intervening years of combat hadn't happened, as if he hadn't been Bazooka Charlie the Mad Major, the tank ace who destroyed German armor in a Piper Cub. He told his students nothing about his war service. He didn't discuss his combat experiences or his decorations or the fact that he had been famous in Third Army. He just taught history, explained the patterns and lessons of previous wars, graded papers in the evening, lived quietly. The 2-year prognosis proved wrong. Carpenter lived for 20 more years, teaching continuously from 1946 until his death on March 22, 1966, at age 53. The Hodgkin's disease eventually killed him, but it took much longer than doctors expected, giving him 2 decades to live in peace, to teach students who had no idea their mild-mannered history teacher had once been one of the most feared pilots in Patton's Third Army, to experience normal life after years of combat. When he died in 1966, most of his students still didn't know the truth about his war service, didn't know about Rosie the Rocketer or the Battle of Arracourt, or the German tanks he had destroyed. They knew him as Mr. Carpenter, the history teacher, patient and knowledgeable, someone who made history interesting without ever mentioning his own role in making it. After the war ended, Carpenter's L-4 Grasshopper serial number 43-30426 was left behind in Europe as surplus military equipment too expensive to ship back to America when thousands of similar aircraft were available in the United States, not obviously worth preserving when neither the Army nor anyone else recognized its historical significance. The aircraft was purchased by an Austrian pilot who repainted it yellow and registered it as a civilian aircraft, the second civilian aircraft registered in newly reformed post-war Austria. For decades it flew in Austria with no one knowing its history, just another Piper Cub used for recreational flying and pilot training. Its combat record completely forgotten, its nose art painted over, its bazooka mounting points removed or hidden by civilian modifications. The aircraft was eventually donated to the Austrian Aviation Museum at Graz Airport, where it was stored disassembled as a restoration project. One of many vintage aircraft in the museum's collection, waiting for time and funding to bring them back to display condition. It sat there for years, decades, its history unknown until 2017, when researchers working for the American Heritage Museum in Massachusetts were searching for World War II aircraft with significant combat records to add to their collection. They were looking specifically for aircraft that had participated in the ground campaign across Europe, aircraft that had supported the advance from Normandy to Germany, and they kept encountering dead ends. Every P-47 Thunderbolt from the 8th Air Force or 9th Air Force had already been spoken for. Every P-51 Mustang with a documented combat record was in someone else's collection. Nothing was available. Then someone mentioned the L-4 in the Austrian Aviation Museum. Initial research revealed its serial number, 43-304126. Further research connected that serial number to Major Charles Carpenter and Rosie the Rocketer. Additional investigation confirmed the aircraft's identity and its remarkable combat record. With 6 German tanks officially credited and possibly 14 destroyed, no other surviving American aircraft from World War II, had a more impressive record of destroying enemy armor. The American Heritage Museum negotiated to acquire the aircraft from the Austrian Museum and arranged to have it shipped to the United States for restoration to its original wartime configuration. The restoration was completed by Colin Powers of Lapine, Oregon, who painstakingly researched period photographs and specifications to recreate the aircraft exactly as Carpenter had flown it in 1944, including the 6 Bazooka mounting system and the cockpit wiring that allowed him to fire them individually or all at once. The nose art was repainted by Carpenter's granddaughter Erin Pater, ensuring that the distinctive Rosie the Rocketer artwork matched the original design Carpenter had personally applied more than 70 years earlier, creating a direct connection between the restored aircraft and the man who had flown it into combat. Today, the L-4H is displayed at the American Heritage Museum in Massachusetts, suspended on wires in an attack configuration behind a German Panther tank, frozen in the moment of a dive attack, just as Carpenter flew dozens of times during his combat tour. The aircraft remains in flying condition and participates in the museum's annual World War II reenactment events each October, taking to the air again briefly before returning to static display, carrying forward the memory of the mild-mannered history teacher who became Bazooka Charlie. The story of Charles Carpenter and Rosie the Rocketer raises fundamental questions about innovation, initiative, and the nature of military effectiveness. Carpenter wasn't supposed to be a tank killer. His aircraft wasn't designed for combat. The Bazooka mounting system violated every convention about how observation aircraft should be employed. Nothing about his transformation from artillery spotter to tank ace followed official doctrine or established procedures. Everything he accomplished came from recognizing that existing methods were inadequate, that American soldiers were dying because the tools available to help them were insufficient, and that someone needed to do something different, even if that meant improvising weapon systems and tactics that didn't officially exist. The military establishment's response to Carpenter's innovation was telling. He wasn't court-martialed for unauthorized modification of government property. He wasn't grounded for exceeding the limitations of his assigned role. He wasn't punished for taking initiative without prior authorization. Instead, he was decorated, promoted, and celebrated because Third Army, and particularly General Patton, valued results over procedures, recognized that winning wars required soldiers who could think creatively and act independently, understood that bureaucratic restrictions should never prevent effective action. This tolerance for improvisation created an organizational culture where people like Carpenter could flourish, where initiative was rewarded rather than punished, where the question wasn't, did you follow the rules, but did you accomplish the mission? Carpenter's story also illustrates the enormous gap between public perception and private reality that many combat veterans experienced after the war. To the American public and to military historians, he was Bazooka Charlie the Mad Major, a legendary figure who had destroyed German tanks in a Piper Cub, an embodiment of American courage and ingenuity. To his students at Urbana High School, he was Mr. Carpenter the history teacher, unremarkable and ordinary, someone who taught class and graded papers and lived a quiet life. Both versions were true, both existed simultaneously. The gap between them represented Carpenter's choice to keep his war experiences private, to not define himself by his combat achievements, to live as a normal person rather than trading on his military record. The fact that his students didn't know about his war service until after his death suggests something important about how many veterans approached reintegration into civilian society. They didn't want to be defined by combat. They didn't want special treatment or attention based on what they had done during the war. They wanted to return to normal life, to do normal work, to be judged by their current contributions rather than their past achievements. Carpenter could have leveraged his combat record into publicity, speaking engagements, book deals, any number of opportunities that would have been available to a decorated tank ace with a remarkable story. He chose instead to teach history to high school students, to live quietly in Illinois, to let his war service remain in the past where it belonged. The contrast between Carpenter's war personality and his civilian personality was dramatic. During the war, he was aggressive to the point of recklessness, attacking German tanks in a fabric-covered observation plane, flying 3 sorties in a single engagement when one would have been dangerous enough. landing in contested territory to capture German prisoners with a discarded rifle. As a civilian, he was mild-mannered and conventional, teaching history according to established curriculum, maintaining discipline in his classroom without being harsh, grading papers carefully and fairly. The transformation suggests that his wartime aggression wasn't his natural personality, but a conscious choice about how to fight effectively. A recognition that in combat, the aggressive side wins even when aggression seems suicidal. That hesitation gets people killed, while decisive action saves lives. The preservation and restoration of Rosie the Rocketer ensures that Carpenter's story will continue to be told to future generations. That visitors to the American Heritage Museum can see the actual aircraft he flew into combat. That the physical reality of the L-4, with its bazooka mounting points and improvised weapon system, makes the story concrete rather than abstract. Seeing the aircraft drives home how small and fragile it was, how insane it seems to attack German tanks in something that looks like a powered kite, how much courage it must have required to dive at Panther tanks, knowing that machine gun fire could shred the fabric covering and kill the pilot before he could pull out of his attack dive. The aircraft makes Carpenter's achievement comprehensible in a way that written descriptions cannot match. The story also serves as a reminder that military effectiveness depends less on advanced technology than on the will to use whatever tools are available creatively and aggressively. Carpenter didn't have specialized anti-tank aircraft. He had a Piper Cub. He didn't have official authorization to mount weapons. He had an ordnance technician willing to help. He didn't have doctrine or tactics or training for employing bazookas from observation aircraft. He figured it out himself through trial and error. The combination of limited resources, creative thinking, and aggressive execution produced results that expensive purpose-built systems often failed to achieve, demonstrating that in war, imagination and courage matter more than equipment and budget. Charles Carpenter was a history teacher who became a tank ace, a mild-mannered educator who became the Mad Major, an observation pilot who became a legend. He destroyed German tanks in an aircraft that wasn't supposed to be armed, using weapons that weren't designed for aerial use, employing tactics he invented himself because no doctrine existed for what he was trying to accomplish. He survived years of combat flying directly into enemy fire, lived 20 years after doctors gave him 2 years, taught history to students who never knew their teacher had made history himself. His L-4 Grasshopper survived the war, spent decades in obscurity, was eventually rediscovered and restored, now hangs in a museum, frozen in an attack dive, a permanent reminder of what one determined pilot accomplished with a Piper Cub and 6 bazookas when he decided that attack was the only way to fight a war. The technical challenges Carpenter faced in developing and employing his bazooka-armed L-4 were substantial and required constant innovation to overcome. The basic problem was that bazookas were designed as shoulder-fired infantry weapons, meant to be aimed and fired by a soldier standing on the ground with the weapon braced against his shoulder, not mounted on an aircraft flying at 90 miles per hour while maneuvering to avoid ground fire. The recoil from firing a bazooka could destabilize a small aircraft if the mounting system wasn't properly designed, potentially causing loss of control at exactly the moment when the pilot needed maximum control to evade enemy fire after attacking. Carpenter and his ordnance technician solved this through careful engineering of the mounting brackets that attached the bazooka tubes to the wing struts, creating a system rigid enough to prevent movement during firing, but flexible enough to absorb recoil without transmitting destructive forces to the aircraft's structure. The electrical firing system presented its own challenges. Each bazooka had to be wired individually to a switch in the cockpit, requiring careful routing of electrical wires through the wing structure without creating short circuits or interference with the aircraft's other electrical systems. The switches had to be positioned where Carpenter could reach them, while keeping both hands on the control stick and throttle, allowing him to fire weapons while simultaneously flying the aircraft through evasive maneuvers. He developed a firing technique where he would line up his attack run, stabilize the aircraft briefly while firing, then immediately resume evasive maneuvering, minimizing the time he spent in a predictable flight path where German gunners could track him effectively. The entire sequence from beginning the attack dive to firing all 6 bazookas to pulling out of the dive and evading ground fire took less than 10 seconds. a brief window where everything had to work perfectly, or he would be shot down. Aiming the bazookas required developing new techniques because the weapons weren't designed for aerial use and had no sights optimized for air-to-ground attacks. Carpenter had to estimate the correct firing point based on his altitude, airspeed, and dive angle, compensating for the rocket's trajectory and the target's movement. Making all these calculations in his head while flying into concentrated enemy fire. He refined his technique through practice and experience, learning the feel of the correct attack geometry, developing an intuitive sense of when to fire that couldn't be taught through formal instruction but came only from repeated combat missions. Other pilots who tried to copy his tactics often failed because they hadn't developed that intuitive understanding, because they lacked the hundreds of hours Carpenter had spent practicing attacks and learning how the weapons behaved under different conditions. The psychological impact of Carpenter's attacks on German forces was significant and persistent. German tank crews had learned to fear American artillery and tank destroyers and fighter bombers, accepting those threats as normal parts of combat they had to defend against and survive. But they hadn't learned to fear Piper Cubs, hadn't developed tactics for dealing with observation aircraft that functioned as attack aircraft, didn't have procedures for responding to attacks from above by weapons that shouldn't exist. The first time a German tank crew saw Rosie the Rocketer diving at them with rockets firing from wing-mounted bazookas, they must have thought they were hallucinating, that the stress of combat had broken their minds because what they were seeing was impossible. By the time they understood the threat was real, their tank was already burning. Word spread through German units about the American observation plane that destroyed tanks, creating a psychological burden beyond the direct casualties Carpenter inflicted. Every time German tank crews saw an L-4 overhead, they had to consider the possibility it was armed and dangerous, had to choose between revealing their position by shooting at it or allowing it to circle unmolested, possibly preparing an attack. The uncertainty created stress and reduced operational effectiveness even when the observation planes circling overhead were unarmed and harmless, because German forces couldn't know which Cubs were dangerous and which weren't, couldn't distinguish Bazooka Charlie from the dozens of other L-4 pilots flying reconnaissance missions throughout the sector. General George Patton's personal involvement in Carpenter's story demonstrated the commander's philosophy about military effectiveness and his willingness to protect subordinates who achieved results through unconventional methods. When Carpenter was nearly court-martialed for accidentally firing on a Sherman bulldozer tank in the confusion of combat, an incident that could have ended his career and possibly resulted in severe punishment, including execution by firing squad under strict interpretation of regulations about friendly fire, Patton intervened personally to stop the court-martial proceedings. Patton not only prevented Carpenter from being punished, but awarded him the Silver Star for the same series of combat actions that had initially resulted in his arrest, sending a clear message throughout Third Army that aggressive offensive action was valued even when it occasionally resulted in mistakes, that taking initiative was rewarded rather than punished, that commanders would protect subordinates who fought hard even when things went wrong. This protection extended beyond Carpenter to the broader culture of improvisation and innovation that characterized Third Army under Patton's leadership. Other pilots who heard about Carpenter's success began experimenting with their own weapon modifications, mounting bazookas and machine guns and other weapons on L-4s and other observation aircraft, creating an informal program of aerial weapons development that had no official authorization but received tacit approval from commanders who cared more about results than regulations. The organizational culture encouraged this experimentation, creating space for people to try new approaches without fear that failure would result in career-ending punishment, understanding that innovation inherently involves risk and that punishing failure discourages the initiative that produces breakthrough successes. The broader military implications of Carpenter's tactics extended beyond the immediate tactical results of his combat missions to influence post-war thinking about close air support and the role of light aircraft in ground combat. His demonstration that small, slow aircraft could effectively attack armored vehicles under certain conditions challenged assumptions about the requirements for effective air-to-ground combat, suggesting that expensive specialized aircraft weren't always necessary when improvised solutions could achieve similar results at much lower cost. The lessons learned from Carpenter's experience informed later developments in close air support doctrine, particularly the recognition that aircraft effectiveness against ground targets depended more on tactics and weapons employment than on aircraft performance specifications, that a slow aircraft flown aggressively could be more effective than a fast aircraft flown cautiously. The Korean War and Vietnam War both saw extensive use of light observation aircraft in roles similar to what Carpenter had pioneered, with pilots marking targets for strike aircraft, coordinating ground operations, and occasionally engaging in direct combat using improvised weapons. The O-1 Bird Dog observation aircraft, used in both conflicts, traced its conceptual lineage directly back to the L-4 Grasshopper, continuing the tradition of employing slow, low-altitude aircraft for reconnaissance and forward air control missions. Some Bird Dog pilots mounted weapons on their aircraft, just as Carpenter had done, though by the Vietnam era the practice was more formally recognized and occasionally authorized, rather than being entirely improvised. The connection between Carpenter's World War II innovations and later developments in close air support demonstrated how individual initiative during wartime could influence military doctrine and tactics for decades afterward. The human cost of Carpenter's aggressive flying style wasn't measured only in the German tanks he destroyed, but in the American lives he saved through his attacks. Every German tank disabled or destroyed by Rosie the Rocketer was a tank that couldn't kill American soldiers, couldn't destroy American vehicles, couldn't disrupt American advances. The Waterpoint crew saved at Arracourt went home to their families after the war specifically, because Carpenter's attacks forced German armor to retreat before overrunning their position. The infantry units Carpenter supported by flying multiple sorties in single engagements accomplished their missions with fewer casualties, because German tanks were destroyed before they could inflict maximum damage. These indirect effects of his combat actions multiplied the value of his service far beyond the simple count of tanks destroyed, creating ripples of consequence that spread through entire units and campaigns. The personal letters Carpenter wrote home during his combat tour reveal the tension between his aggressive public persona and his private understanding of mortality and risk. In one August 1944 letter, he wrote, "Lately I have been taking quite a few chances, but my luck has been marvelous. Yesterday I got a bullet hole through the wing and hit a church steeple with one wheel. It was very little for what might have happened under the circumstances." The calm, matter-of-fact tone of this description, treating near-death experiences as minor incidents barely worth mentioning, demonstrated either extraordinary courage or extraordinary denial, or possibly both. He understood he was risking his life every time he flew into combat, understood that his aggressive tactics exposed him to concentrated enemy fire that could kill him at any moment. But he continued attacking anyway because the mission required it and because he believed hesitation and caution cost more lives than they saved. The relationship between Carpenter's pre-war background as a history teacher and his combat effectiveness as a pilot created interesting parallels between studying military history and making it. As a teacher, he had analyzed countless battles and campaigns, explaining to students how commanders made decisions, how tactics evolved, how individual actions affected outcomes. As a pilot, he was making the same kinds of decisions in real time under combat conditions, implementing tactics he invented himself, creating outcomes that would later be studied by other students and teachers, analyzing World War II battles. The feedback loop between historical knowledge and historical action gave him a unique perspective on combat, understanding both the academic patterns of how wars were won and the immediate visceral reality of fighting, able to see his own actions as both immediate tactical problems to solve and as historical events that would be analyzed by future generations. The question of whether Carpenter's tactics could have been scaled up to create a formal program of bazooka-armed observation aircraft was debated during the war and afterward. The practical obstacles were significant. Training pilots to attack ground targets effectively required extensive practice that most observation pilots didn't have time for. Modifying aircraft and maintaining weapon systems required ordnance expertise that wasn't always available. Ammunition consumption was high because bazookas could only fire single shots before requiring reload, and the vulnerability of slow, low-altitude aircraft meant that losses would be substantial if the tactics were employed widely against defended targets. Carpenter's success depended on his exceptional skill as a pilot, his mechanical knowledge from his pre-war background, and probably a significant amount of luck that allowed him to survive dozens of attacks when statistical probability suggested he should have been shot down. Replicating that success across hundreds of aircraft and pilots might not have been feasible even if the military establishment had wanted to try. Nevertheless, the fact that one pilot in one aircraft achieved such remarkable results demonstrated the potential value of aggressive improvisation and suggested that military organizations should create space for experimentation and individual initiative rather than requiring strict adherence to established doctrine. The tension between standardization and innovation is ongoing in military organizations, with standardization providing efficiency and predictability, while innovation provides adaptability and breakthrough capabilities. Carpenter's story illustrated the value of the innovation side of that equation, showing that sometimes the best solutions come from individual soldiers solving immediate problems using whatever resources they have available, rather than waiting for official doctrine and proper equipment to arrive. The final years of Carpenter's life, teaching history at Urbana High School, created a poignant contrast between his public obscurity and his private knowledge of what he had accomplished during the war. He stood in front of classrooms full of teenagers, teaching them about World War II battles and campaigns, explaining how wars were fought and won, never mentioning that he had personally fought in some of those battles, never revealing that he was one of the most decorated pilots in Third Army, never seeking recognition or special treatment based on his combat record. His students learned history from him without knowing they were learning from someone who had made history, without understanding that their teacher was a living example of the courage and innovation he described when teaching about other military heroes. The anonymity was deliberate, reflecting Carpenter's choice to define himself by his current work rather than his past achievements, to be judged as a teacher rather than trading on his military service. When Carpenter died in 1966 and the truth about his war service became public, many of his former students expressed shock and amazement that their mild-mannered history teacher had been Bazooka Charlie, that the man who had patiently explained historical battles to them had personally destroyed German tanks in one of the war's most dangerous assignments, that someone so ordinary in civilian life had been extraordinary in combat. The gap between who they thought he was and who he actually was challenged their assumptions about what heroes look like, about whether remarkable people are always obviously remarkable, or whether they often hide their achievements behind normal conventional exteriors. The lesson extended beyond Carpenter himself to all the World War II veterans who returned to civilian life and resumed ordinary careers without discussing their war experiences, who carried remarkable stories privately rather than seeking public recognition, who defined themselves by their peacetime contributions rather than their wartime service. The preservation and display of Rosie the Rocketer at the American Heritage Museum serves multiple purposes beyond simply exhibiting a historically significant aircraft. It provides a physical connection to Carpenter's story that makes the history tangible and real, rather than abstract, allowing visitors to see the actual aircraft he flew and understand viscerally how small and fragile it was, how impossible it seems to attack tanks in something that looks like it could barely carry its own weight. The museum's decision to display the aircraft in an attack configuration suspended above a German Panther tank creates a dramatic tableau that captures the essence of Carpenter's combat missions, freezing the moment of maximum danger and maximum courage in a permanent exhibit that communicates the story even to visitors who never read the accompanying text. The fact that the aircraft remains airworthy and occasionally flies at museum events creates opportunities for people to see and hear it in flight, experiencing the sound and appearance of the L-4 in motion rather than just examining it statically. The experience of watching Rosie the Rocketer take off and fly overhead, hearing the small engine laboring to keep the aircraft airborne, seeing how slowly it moves compared to modern aircraft, makes Carpenter's achievement even more remarkable, driving home how vulnerable he must have been during his attack runs, how much courage it required to dive at German tanks in an aircraft that couldn't escape through speed and couldn't survive through armor. Charles Carpenter's transformation from history teacher to tank ace to history teacher again created a complete arc that spoke to the civilian-soldier-civilian transition millions of Americans experienced during World War II. He wasn't a career military officer. He was an ordinary person who served when called, fought effectively and courageously, and returned to ordinary life afterward. His story represented the broader American experience of the war, the temporary transformation of civilians into warriors, and their subsequent transformation back into civilians. The discontinuity between wartime and peacetime identity that shaped a generation. The fact that he succeeded brilliantly in both roles demonstrated that effectiveness in one domain doesn't require specialization or career focus, that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demand it, that the transition back to ordinary life after extraordinary service is possible and valuable even if it means setting aside achievements that would define most people's entire identity.